This podcast is made possible by our supporters on Patreon, who pledge an amount to contribute every month and in return get exclusive access to bonus content, merchandise discounts, and much more. If you'd like to join our family, please go to patreon.com/Gotham Variety and subscribe. That's Patreon/Gotham Variety.
And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of the Gotham Variety Podcast. I want to welcome all of our listeners. I thank you very much for your support and for joining me today, hoping you enjoy this first episode of a brand new series, Real-Time 1960s, a kind of ongoing parallel universe of 60 years ago through podcasts and social media posts on our rapidly growing Facebook page, which you should all follow, by the way, facebook.com/realtime1960s. A really great community of all ages and backgrounds, close to 4,000 followers already. And I especially value the comments by people who remember the subject matter that I'm posting about. And on that page, you will not find anything about coronavirus, nothing about lockdowns, no Trump, no Biden. Nope, none of that. All gone. And no great loss, because it is not August 10th, 2020 on that page. It is August 10th, 1960. So today, I'm posting about Democratic nominee John F. Kennedy patching up his feud with Harry Truman, President Eisenhower's response to Fidel Castro's latest provocations, Vice President Nixon's campaign strategy, a new film called The Last Days of Pompeii by a novice director named Sergio Leone, and 24-year-old Wilt Chamberlain's contract extension with the Philadelphia Warriors, all of which happened 60 years ago today. And tomorrow, of course, I'll post about August 11th, 1960, on and on through the decade. And I post these things in the present tense with the best pictures or video I can possibly find, as I would have if I was around back then and social media existed in the 1960s. That's a decade that I was mostly not around for. I was born in the spring of 1969, but a decade that I look forward to exploring in great detail, not just on social media, but through podcasts as well. And today's topic, Decision 1960, and we'll review the spring primaries and the July conventions that nominated Kennedy and Nixon, and we'll do it with distinguished historian Gary Donaldson right after this.
You can follow us on Twitter @Gotham Variety, like us on Facebook, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. We're on Spotify as well. Check out our website at gothamvariety.com, where you can send us your comments and questions. And if you love what we're doing, we'd love a 5-star review on the podcast platform of your choice. Reviews and ratings help keep our show on the charts, so more and more people can find us.
We are joined this week on Gotham Variety by a very special guest, Dr. Gary Donaldson, professor of American history at Xavier University of Louisiana and author of many books on American political history, including The First Modern Campaign, Kennedy, Nixon, and the Election of 1960. Gary, it's great to have you on the show. How are you?
Thank you. Yes, very good.
You know, one of the things I appreciated about your book is its even-handedness. Unlike many historians, especially those who cover Kennedy, it seems, you offer a pretty clear-eyed assessment of each candidate, separating rhetoric from substance. Now, you've written about a number of presidential elections, including 1948, 52, and 64. So I'm wondering what your specific goals are when approaching this kind of book.
Well, I've always liked to write books about elections. 60 seemed to be obvious. I started out writing about 1964. So many people have done so many things about 1968, and 1956 is not very interesting. So 1960 election seemed like an obvious way to go. I really enjoy the debates, and really trying to make that the first modern campaign. I know that sounds like a bumper sticker cliche, and it's probably true, but But to me, it is very much that American politics really did change as a result of that.
So let's set the stage as far as the political climate of 1960, starting with the Republicans. Now, despite the fact that Eisenhower had been president for almost 2 full terms and remained popular, there were divisions in the GOP between the moderates, people like Eisenhower himself and Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York, and the conservatives, whose standard bearer at that time was Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. So I'm wondering if you could nail down some of the differences between these two groups in 1960.
Well, Nixon had been very, very, very conservative. He had really been on McCarthy's right hand. And there was a joke, I think it's Stephen Ambrose who said it, he was McCarthy with a button-down shirt. I think that was probably true. Rockefeller had come from a big city. He needed the support of civil rights, probably needed the support of labor and so forth. So Rockefeller was really what's usually referred to today as a moderate. Now, Goldwater was just getting the conservative side of the Republican Party going. You could really argue that the Republican Party had 3 different wings, a left, a right, and a center.
And Nixon had been the darling of the right wing when he was in Congress. He helped break the Alger Hiss communist spy case in 1948, and then he was picked as Eisenhower's running mate to appease the right wing. But as you note in your book, as vice president, he shifted a bit toward Eisenhower's middle of the road, giving us the first of several new Nixons. So was this shift out of loyalty to the president? Was it to facilitate his own presidential ambitions? Or did he really have a softening of views?
Probably all of those together. I had always thought that Nixon wanted to be down the middle of the road because Eisenhower kept talking about being down the middle of the road and being strongly centrist and becoming extremely popular because of it. And so Nixon sort of followed that lead. That's the way I have always seen it. That was what people refer to as the new Nixon, is to me a more moderate Nixon.
And despite Nixon's loyalty, there was talk in 1956 that he would be dumped from the ticket. Eisenhower seemed to kind of leave him twisting in the wind there for a while. Now, Eisenhower's dealings with Nixon, from my vantage point, seem almost borderline sadistic at times, or maybe passive-aggressive. That's a better term. He was constantly damning him with faint praise or worse. For example, when a Time magazine reporter in the thick of the 1960 campaign asked Eisenhower for a major idea of Nixon's that he'd adopted, he said, "If you give me a week, I might think of one." Now, he may have been joking, but from Nixon's perspective, that had to hurt, and it was actually used in a Kennedy attack ad. So what was Ike's attitude toward his vice president, and how seriously did he consider dumping him in 1956?
I think he really wanted to dump him. I really do. I think he either wanted to dump him or he wanted Nixon to become Secretary of State, which would also mean that he would be dumped and Nixon would get the experience that he needed in foreign policy. And finally, Nixon, you have to realize something. I mean, Nixon, it's not like Nixon could go back into the Senate or go back into the House. If Nixon got dumped off the ticket, I mean, the only thing he could do was go back to California to be a lawyer. I mean, that was just about it. And so Nixon went to Eisenhower and said, "Thank you for accepting me as your running mate." And Eisenhower said, "Well, okay, fine, let's go ahead and take it. Let's do it." And I think that's pretty much the way it went. I don't think Eisenhower ever really liked Nixon. Nixon was in the hospital a couple of times, and Eisenhower went to see him, and Eisenhower mentioned more than once to Ann Whitman or somebody near him, that Brownell or someone, that nobody ever comes to visit Nixon, but he was really willing to accept him. Eisenhower had been that way in the military his entire life. There have been people close to Eisenhower who really were not very nice people, weren't liked very well, but Eisenhower accepted them. If they were, someone like Patton, if he was competent, then Eisenhower would go ahead and accept people like that.
Okay, so we talked about divisions in the GOP, but the Democrats had their own issues, mostly stemming from civil rights. With every push forward, no matter how tentative or minuscule, you had major pushback from the Jim Crow Southerners, who were a big part of that party's bloc and had been for decades. Now, looking at Adlai Stevenson, a former governor of Illinois, Democrat nominee in both 52 and 56, you write in your book that he was billed as an intellectual and a liberal, but that he really wasn't either. And I wonder if you could expand on that for the listeners.
I think that has a lot to do with Eleanor Roosevelt, who was perceived really as the successor to her husband, and she liked Adlai Stevenson. Now, Stevenson was sharp, he was a good speaker, he was even funny. I think Democrats on the left sort of saw him as a success, and then of course he had Eleanor Roosevelt's support. So I think a lot of people wanted to see him as a successor to FDR. And there were a lot of people who seemed to think that even though Stevenson was not liberal, that you could put Schlesinger and others around him who were liberal, the Americans for Democratic Action, and make him be liberal like FDR had been liberal. I think there was that. And I think there was also this hatred of Nixon and this idea that Eisenhower was kind of holding things stable and not moving forward.
Now, like Nixon, Lyndon Johnson, Senate Majority Leader since 1955, had long-time presidential ambitions. And also like Nixon, he had to appease various factions in his party. And one thing that strikes me as I read more about this election, a lot of people in 1960 in the press, in the civil rights movement, in Kennedy's camp as well, saw Johnson as a conservative. But he had been a big New Dealer, and he'd also pushed a civil rights bill through Congress in 1957. Emasculated, yes, but not completely insignificant. And then, of course, later, he became one of the most liberal presidents ever, at least domestically. So where on the political spectrum would you place Johnson in the 1950s, and what sort of adjustments, if any, did he make to position himself better for 1960?
Johnson had a real problem. He was from Texas, and no matter how hard he tried, people saw him as being a Southerner. He wanted to try to convince voters that he was a Westerner. It just didn't work, no matter how Johnson tried, mainly because of Richard Russell from Georgia, who just kept continually supporting him. Johnson's always been a difficult problem for me, and sometimes he's conservative, sometimes he's not so. And you're right about the 57 Civil Rights Act, and again the 1960 Civil Rights Act, which nobody pays much attention to, but it was also that very important. And you said that though both of those bills were emasculated. Well, both of those bills were emasculated by Johnson, and a lot of people saw Johnson as very conservative. Johnson was one of those presidents who had a tendency to just follow the wind. If the wind wanted him to be liberal, then in the 1960s, when Lyndon Johnson was president, he would be liberal. And if you really, really look hard at those bills that were passed by Lyndon Johnson when he was president, not very many of them were really funded properly. Now, people want to blame the Vietnam War, but there was never enough money to make those bills work. And like I said, people want to blame the Vietnam War for that, but Johnson was just an extremely conservative man. And he gives like Kennedy, he gives the impression, like Stevenson, he gives the impression of being liberal. But there's something about Lyndon Johnson that's always bothered me. He's not really an American liberal, not like FDR had been.
Well, the reason I would disagree with that is that Johnson's instincts, it seems to me, were to use the power and resources of the government to solve problems. And that seems to me like textbook 20th century liberalism.
Yes, I would agree with that. Yes, I think that's true. But like I said, if you look at these programs, and he saw the civil rights movement moving in one direction, and he would go right along with it. And yes, he did increase the government, and he did And those bills did increase the government. But like I said, if you look at them real closely, you don't see a lot of funding.
All right. Well, shifting to Kennedy, as you said, like Stevenson, historically viewed as progressive, I guess partially because as president, he was kind of pushed into being more vocal on civil rights than Eisenhower had been, when spiraling events in the South kind of forced his hand. But if you look at those debates in 1960, he's actually running to the right of Nixon at times, not on civil rights, but certainly on foreign policy. He's kind of out hawking the hawk. And the liberal wing of the party was less than enthused about him. Now, did this have more to do with the father, who had been a big supporter of Senator Joe McCarthy, actually of Nixon as well? Or did this have to do with Kennedy's own record, or both?
Well, probably a bit of both. The liberals in the party, and you're looking particularly at Eleanor Roosevelt and Truman, who to me is a populist in the party, he needed their support. He and Nixon didn't have that many differences, really. Particularly when you look at the debates and read the debates, they're not that different than each other. And they've kind of led to a age-old American concept that the two political parties are pretty much the same. Well, they're not, of course, but in 1960, you might have seen it that way, and I could understand that. But Kennedy, ever since Obama, I've always thought about Kennedy as hope and hoping for a better future to come, something different, something new, something younger. But then he was killed, and so we didn't get to see any of that. And then Bobby, yes, but then Bobby was killed, so we didn't get to see that. But there was a genuine hope, I think, that was important.
But what was it about Kennedy that people like Eleanor Roosevelt opposed so strongly? Because there was a Stop Kennedy movement, right?
Yeah, oh yes, sure there was. The question is whether or not Stevenson was a part of that or not, and I think Stevenson was not. I think that Kennedy had a lot of interest in McCarthy and his brother and McCarthy was at the House more than once, at Hyannisport more than once. Kennedy had supported the Nixon bill. He had even supported HUAC some, and he was a very young playboy-like kind of guy. And a lot of liberals really didn't like Kennedy. But to me, by 1960, Kennedy was one of the guys. He was in there. He was in the arena, as Nixon likes to say. I think Nixon hoped to punch him out, but it didn't happen.
No, it didn't. But probably the two most prominent party figures opposed to JFK's nomination were Eleanor Roosevelt and Harry Truman. Eleanor accused him, or I guess accused his father, of buying the nomination. She claimed on ABC TV that Joseph Kennedy, quote, has been spending oodles of money all over the country and probably has a representative in every state by now, unquote, which drew a pretty hot response from JFK. Talk about the fascinating back and forth, much of it public, between Eleanor and JFK.
Yeah, it was in her article she wrote about him. And the Kennedy people called it the oodles comment. There was this belief among the left wing and the Democratic Party that Kennedy was really buying the nomination for the Democrats. Yeah, I'm not sure that it was necessarily true, but there was a belief that was so. And Kennedy did respond and really forced her, because all the people who worked for Kennedy were volunteers. They really were. And Kennedy did push her into a corner. Now, they were throwing money around, particularly in West Virginia, but John Kennedy did push her into a corner and force her to come out. Retractions or promise to write retractions. And if you don't know what you're talking about, shut up. And that was pretty much what he was saying to her. And she did. She was quiet about it. She never said anything else.
And as you said, your book talks about 1960 as the first modern campaign. And certainly mass media, the primacy of the image, or optics, as we call it now, was central to that modernization. And 1960 is really where this kind of insidious transformation of presidential politics into reality TV has its origin, which I guess was kind of an unintended consequence. But there was something else that year that was different, and that was the greater importance of the primary elections. So what differentiated the primaries of that 1960 cycle from other presidential cycles?
At the time, some of those states, like West Virginia, were just what we call today beauty contest where the delegates really don't have to vote any particular way. And of course, the primary in 1960, the primaries in 1960, the big one in Wisconsin, the big one in West Virginia, were really mostly designed for Kennedy to get his face in front of the American people, to get his face on television, where 88% of the American people had TVs at that time, and for them to see him and to see that he was competent, that he was not some young little scrawny kid with rickets who was a playboy and wanted to be president. And he could stand up there toe-to-toe with Nixon and talk to him. He achieved that first in Wisconsin and then definitely in West Virginia. The delegates that came out of there didn't really have to vote for him. Kennedy didn't care. He didn't give a damn at all. All he wanted to do was get his face out there.
So as it turned out, Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota was Kennedy's only competition on the campaign trail that winter and spring, since Johnson refused to campaign. We'll get into that. And Stevenson was kind of playing it coy. And Kennedy took Humphrey on in Wisconsin, Hubert's backyard. And for the listeners, there's a good documentary on iTunes about this primary. It's called Primary. And it's one of the first, maybe the first, cinema verite films by a guy named Robert Drew, who did a couple of others on JFK. The best one is called Crisis. That one deals with the integration of the University of Alabama in 1963, where Kennedy, mostly Robert actually, locked horns with Governor George Wallace. But Gary, talk about the importance of Wisconsin in 1960 and how Kennedy managed to win that election on April 5th, although not by a wide margin.
He didn't win by a wide margin, and when you really took the numbers and broke them down, he got the Catholic vote. And so he left Wisconsin to go to West Virginia, and the word was, we've got to go to West Virginia and do it all over again. He couldn't go into the general election with only the Catholic vote. So he had to go to West Virginia, which was primarily Protestant, win in West Virginia, and prove that he was a vote getter. Now, I've said this over and over again. There are big names. MacArthur's probably the best example, Douglas MacArthur. No matter where they went, no matter what they did, people just would not vote for them. And there was a fear that Kennedy might be like that. And so Kennedy had to prove that he could get votes. Protestants, Catholics, anybody, everybody, labor, liberals, everybody would vote for him. That was his big achievement in Wisconsin and then in West Virginia.
And Wisconsin is where Jacqueline Kennedy kind of emerges as a political force in her own right as far as turning out the vote. She also played a big role in West Virginia, right?
That's right. In fact, John Kennedy at one time made the point that Jackie Kennedy would walk one side of the street, John Kennedy would walk the other side of the street, and Jackie Kennedy had more people around her than Jack did. And he made the point several times to some people close to him that, Jackie's got more attention than me over there.
And she would maintain that popularity in the years to come. But as you said, because Kennedy only scored big with Catholics in Wisconsin, he had to do it all over again in mostly Protestant West Virginia. And this is where Kennedy appears in a TV debate for the first time with Hubert Humphrey, which you can see on YouTube, by the way. So what impact, if any, did that debate have on the voting May 10th? Because Theodore White, a political historian who was actually a schoolmate of JFK's older brother Joe, who was killed in the war. White would later help create that whole Camelot myth. But Theodore White had very complimentary things to say about Kennedy's performance in that debate.
I don't really know if that debate had a great deal of impact. I do know that Theodore White said something about the round face of Kennedy on the television, and to show that he has no horns, or whatever it was, whatever the quote was. And I think that was all very important.
Yeah, ironically, that rounded face was a side effect of the cortisone treatments for Addison's disease, which Kennedy denied having, but which he most certainly did have.
Right. That was the same thing with he was so tanned at the first debate with Nixon. Well, he was so tanned not because he'd been in the California sun, which is what it always said, but it was because he was taking cortisone shots.
And another good point you make in your book, which is fascinating to consider, is that Lyndon Johnson missed a huge opportunity by not competing in West Virginia. That's a state whose voters would certainly have found him an attractive candidate. First of all, he was Protestant. He had his roots in the New Deal and in the South, and he also had firsthand experience with poverty. West Virginia had the lowest median income in the country, and it still does, I think. So it's fascinating how this kind of uncharacteristic passivity on Johnson's part may have changed the entire course of the country, because that primary was critical in JFK's march to the nomination. So what was Johnson thinking? I mean, how did he plan to win the nomination without campaigning?
That's a question that that's always bothered me. Johnson was an extremely reticent man. There are times when he decided that he was just going to quit, just going to give up in the 1960s and just stop being president of the United States. He kind of did that often. And his idea was that he thought that he could use his resume and his achievements in the Senate to appeal to voters, and they would vote for him. And he kept sticking his toe in the water and then nah, maybe not. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. And by the time he decided to jump in, it was just too damn late. He would have been a good candidate. He could have made a real mark in West Virginia, but he just wouldn't do it. He just wouldn't.
Now, we mentioned earlier the two oppositional figures in the GOP, Goldwater and Rockefeller. But in the midst of Nixon's dealings with those two in 1960, he also established a relationship with Ronald Reagan, who I believe was still a Democrat at that point, but he would change that registration and campaign for Nixon, and then for Goldwater in 64. So who initiated that relationship? Of what did it consist? And what did Nixon and Reagan see in each other in 1960?
Reagan did initiate it, I think. Reagan wrote longhand letters out all the time. They were both from California. They both had started poor and had risen up. Both of them had. And I think Reagan appreciated that. Reagan hated Rockefeller. And any time that he could damage Rockefeller, he would. And when Nixon tried to bring Rockefeller into the campaign, Reagan was mad about it and wrote to Nixon telling him any association with Rockefeller is going to get me out of the program.
Now, was Reagan's hatred of Rockefeller personal or just political?
Oh, it's probably just political. I don't think there was anything personal. Nixon wanted Rockefeller on the ticket with him, and I think that was the right move. I think that was the right thing to do.
Yep, I agree.
But Rockefeller would have nothing to do with it.
So the Democrats had their convention first, and Kennedy arrived in Los Angeles just 161 votes shy of a first ballot nomination, but there were still other candidates supported by different elements of that Stop Kennedy movement. Johnson officially jumped into the race on July 5th, just 6 days before the convention. Stevenson hadn't officially declared, but he had liberal support from people like Eleanor Roosevelt and Eugene McCarthy. And then there was Senator Stuart Symington, supported by his fellow Missourian Harry Truman. Truman probably would have been just as happy with Johnson, if not more so. But there was some very public friction between Truman and Kennedy. They had these dueling press conferences, and then a boycott of the convention by Truman. So what was that all about?
Truman always hated Kennedy. He always did. I don't know if it goes back to Joe Kennedy or what, but Truman was always a populist. He didn't like the Harvard mouth. He didn't like the big money from Daddy, and he didn't like all that stuff. Truman really never got along with Eleanor really very well.
Right, which may have been a culture clash as much as anything. But with that Stop Kennedy movement, was that the threat it was made out to be? And how did the Kennedy forces finally kind of break the back of that movement at the convention and knock his competitors out for good?
Well, I don't think that was really very strong. I think part of the problem was that Johnson refused to kind of really be the leader of the Stop Kennedy forces. Obviously, Stevenson was not going to do it. And of course, the delegates, he held most of the delegates the Wyoming finally put him over the top at the very end of the balloting. And from that point on, I don't think there was any, he just shoved the rest of them out of the way.
So succeeding in his quest for a first ballot nomination, the next order of business was to choose a running mate. And there's been no shortage of wildly diverging stories about the final choice of Johnson and how that played out. I mean, that pick to me seems like an absolute no-brainer. But before we get to the various stories about whether Johnson accepted or didn't accept initially, and Robert Kennedy's role in all that, what were some of the factors that Kennedy had to consider when mulling his top two choices, Symington and Johnson, for running mate?
Oh, the question undoubtedly was Texas. I mean, if Johnson could deliver Texas, Kennedy could win. That's all there was to it. And I'm like you. I mean, the Boston-Austin axis, or whatever it was called, was a smart thing to do. I mean, even though the Kennedy people didn't like Johnson, called him Mr. Cornpone and all that stuff. And Johnson didn't have that big college education and all those things. But to pull Johnson in, to get him out of the Senate, was just smart. And he did. And the whole thing, like I said, was Texas. He had to win Texas. It turned out he won New York. That surprised me, but he had to have Texas.
And as far as the offer to Johnson, I mean, has it ever been established how that played out on July 14th between JFK, RFK, and Johnson? Because a number of commentators have pointed at this as kind of the first shot of later antagonism between Johnson and Robert Kennedy. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, nor is it clear to me how deep or how consequential, let's say, because it did exist, but how deep that antagonism ran. Because if you look ahead to 1964, Johnson actually had a strong hand in Robert Kennedy's very close election win to the Senate. Johnson campaigned very hard for Robert Kennedy in New York multiple times. Of course, having a Democrat in the Senate was in his interest as president, but what went on in Los Angeles in 1960 with that Johnson pick?
Supposedly, Bobby went up to the room more than once. Johnson had already accepted. Bobby opposed it, didn't like it, told John that was a big mistake. Arthur Schlesinger said it was a big mistake.
So on what grounds were they saying it was a mistake? Because that sounds crazy to me.
Because Kennedy was the youthful new guy. Now, I made the point in the book that Kennedy was not new. He really was not new. He was young, he had long hair, he had young people around him. All of that's true. But Johnson already had a heart attack. He looked like an old guy. He was an old Paul. He'd been in the Senate for a while. Richard Russell thought he was great. Sam Rayburn thought he was great. He was one of the old guys. Kennedy was one of the new guys, and the people around Kennedy were considered to be new people. And now here, John Kennedy's bringing in Lyndon Johnson, who appeared to them at least to be a riverboat gambler, which of course he wasn't. They just didn't like him. He wasn't part of the circle. But of course, like you and I both agree, he was the right thing to do. He was the right thing. Undoubtedly so.
And the big story heading into the Republican convention was the ongoing negotiation between Nixon and Rockefeller. Rockefeller refused to join the ticket or to endorse, until finally, on July 22nd, just 3 days before the convention, Nixon initiated a meeting at Rockefeller's apartment where they hashed out what became known as the Fifth Avenue Treaty, or to Goldwater, the Fifth Avenue Surrender. Essentially, it was the party platform for 1960, which met most of Rockefeller's preferences, including stronger civil rights and a more vigorous defense policy. So was the right-wing opposition to that treaty about the substance or the way it was done? Because I can understand, I mean, if you look at it from the perspective of a Republican delegate from some other part of the country, you know, the idea that your platform had been hammered out by two people in a Fifth Avenue penthouse, that may have been tough to swallow. I mean, it's not really how a platform is supposed to be constructed, right?
Right. Well, the platform had already been written by Percy and some others in Chicago, I think it was.
Yeah.
And this was a 14-point statement. Rockefeller would not leave his apartment. Nixon came there. It appeared to Goldwater and others that Rockefeller had summoned Nixon to his lair and simply dictated to Nixon, well, this is the way it would be. The biggest mistake I think probably that Nixon made was to go home afterward and sleep till noon the next day. And that gave Rockefeller enough time to put it out, to show the world, really. It ended up on AP and several other wire services and mimeograph sheets at the convention, and that he had written it all, and Nixon had just kind of sat there and took dictation. So I think for the right wing, whether it was the content or the people involved, who they were, it seemed to be a Rockefeller statement that Nixon just kind of went along with. I really do feel like, to heal the party's wounds, Nixon and Rockefeller should have run together in 1960, and I think that would have been an unbeatable couple to run in that year. I think that Kennedy would have had a lot of trouble with those two.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with you.
Yeah.
So with Rockefeller out of the running for the number 2 spot, Nixon follows the advice of party leaders, President Eisenhower, Everett Dirksen, he was the Senate minority leader then. And so Nixon picks Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. as his running mate, old political family, World War II veteran, 2 terms as senator from Massachusetts. Actually, he was beaten by JFK in '52. So what was the thought process behind this pick? And in your opinion, was there a better available choice for Nixon?
Well, there has to have been a better choice. Henry Cabot Lodge was a very quiet man. There was a definite push for Nixon to bring in somebody with foreign policy background, and it was perceived, and whether it was right or wrong, that Lodge was a foreign policy guy. He had been an ambassador to the UN, I think.
Yep.
And the thing that I always recall about Henry Cabot Lodge, and you may not know this, is Henry Cabot Lodge was a very, very tall man, and Richard Nixon was very short. And for the two of them to appear together on a podium was wrong. It was really a mistake for a tall vice presidential candidate to stand next to a short presidential candidate. And that really made Nixon look terrible.
Yeah, Nixon, man, he always seemed to get the short end of the stick when it came to optics, especially that year.
Yes, I know. And then, of course, on top of that, Lodge made a statement or two in Harlem about Nixon's candidacy, about Nixon's cabinet, that Nixon had to backpedal on, I think.
Yeah, without consulting Nixon, he pledged in Harlem that their administration would appoint an African-American to the cabinet.
That's right. And Nixon had no intention of doing anything like that.
Right, at least not solely on that basis.
And he had to walk that back. And I think Lodge was probably, I don't want to say detrimental, but he didn't really help Nixon very much. Eisenhower liked him because Lodge had really taken the mantle in 1952 when Ike continued to, I don't know if you recall this, but Ike could not leave NATO. He could not run for president and be a general at the same time. So he had to stay commander of NATO and let Henry Cabot Lodge run his campaign for him. And Ike loved that. He just thought that was great. He thought that Lodge was one of the good guys. And there was a perception that this Boston Brahmin type paired up with Nixon from the West Coast would really help the candidacy. And Lodge was perceived as a moderate, and Nixon was still considered to be on the right.
And those two picks, Johnson and Lodge, I mean, that may have been the difference right there in an election where almost 70 million people voted, and the difference between the two candidates ended up being like 100,000 votes. So it's fascinating, and man, what a dramatic and pivotal election that was. The book is called The First Modern Campaign, Kennedy, Nixon, and the Election of 1960. Pick it up. It's concise yet penetrating, and it also provides a good deal of important historical context that we didn't have time to get into today. Gary, great work here. Thanks so much for being part of the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. If you're going to do any other campaigns, give me a call. I'm good at campaigns.
Will do. All right, we'll come back. More Gotham Variety in just a moment.
Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Gotham Variety, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, joe@gothamvariety.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and get exclusive access to bonus content, please go to patreon.com/GothamVariety and subscribe.
And that'll do it for this week's episode of Real Time 1960s on Gotham Variety. Don't forget to check us out and subscribe on Apple, Stitcher, or Spotify so you don't miss a single episode. Follow us at facebook.com/realtime1960s. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care, and I'll see you soon.